How are you doing, John?
I'm hanging in there. Just me and my Cocker Spaniel,
Absolutely. I hear you there.
getting a lot of quality time with her.
Definitely. That's a positive, a
It's
positive
one
of,
of the few. One of it might be the only positive of
yeah.
the pandemic.
Well, at least for those of us in the Northeast area, the coronavirus crisis is at least somewhat progressing. So that's
Yeah,
positive too. So,
but it
which we'll
feels like
dive
it's
into.
exciting when you look at the numbers here, but of course, if you look at the headlines elsewhere, it doesn't look so good.
Definitely. We'll dive into that in another 15, 20 seconds. We'll get started and dive into the good stuff here. I know you have some reporting that we can touch on, and we had a couple questions come in. And for those tuning in as well, just wanted to draw your attention. If you have any questions that pop up for John, there's a Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to put any questions as you're listening to the information, and we'll try to leave some time at the end to take some of those questions as well. So we'll get started here, John. I know we were just talking a little bit before we started the session about some of the reporting in terms of some of the economic developments, some things around evictions and rent and things like that that might affect small businesses. So why don't we kick it off this morning, touch on some of your reporting from the last week, kind of from those two topics, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Great. Yeah, so two of the things that I worked on last week, one was a story about the eviction moratorium here in Massachusetts. Basically, with only a few exceptions, it's impossible to evict someone, and this also applies to some small businesses, through August 18th. And there's a lot of talk about extending that moratorium. I think it's likely it will get extended. So landlords, there are plenty of landlords that are losing their shirt too. And so they've sued the state saying this is unconstitutional. And they were hoping that the Supreme Judicial Court would take it up on constitutional grounds. And the SJC essentially punted and said, no, we're sending this to Superior Court. Now, the SJC can take things up really quickly. I mean, so can Superior Court, but generally when you're going to lower court, it takes a lot longer to get resolved. So I think the eviction moratorium will likely survive this court challenge at least through August 18th, if not longer. The other big thing that happened last week in terms of businesses and COVID-19 in Massachusetts was the governor's economic development bill. Now, he filed that bill right before COVID-19 hit. And now, of course, things have changed completely. It's now being considered more like an economic recovery bill. Originally, it was $240 million, mostly borrowed money. Now they've increased it to $275 million. And it includes grants for micro businesses, businesses under 20 employees, includes money for small business loans and some like technical assistance for to help small businesses. It also includes money to renovate blighted or vacant buildings. So they're really targeted at sections of the economy and parts of the state that have been hit hard by COVID-19. I think, just talking to the Senator Eric Lesser, who's the co-chairman of the Economic Development Committee, he thinks $275 million just isn't going to cut it. And so I would guess that when it comes out of his committee, it'll be bigger, because it's borrowed money. The state can get away with, I would say, taking a little more money in this package than they normally would, because they can pay it off over time. Presumably better times will be ahead when they can pay off everything. So those are the two big stories in business last week in Massachusetts. And maybe we can also, I don't know if you want to have any questions about that, or you want to get into some of the questions that you from some of our Slack community members.
Yeah, there. In terms of the small business Slack community, a lot of the talk has been about rent. So I'm just curious, for the benefit of those members of the community. Some people are still having trouble, paying their rent. We've heard from some business owners because of what phase they're in, reopening protocols and being able to generate revenue. So in terms of the lawsuit and everything that's swirling around, what do you think is a realistic timeline in terms of an extension? Do you think the government's going to be playing it by ear based on, we're seeing spikes in other parts of the country? Is that going to be a factor? what should businesses expect kind of in the next 30 days through July, leading up to, that 6 weeks away when, it's set to expire? What's kind of a realistic timeline, do you think, with the lawsuit and everything?
Well, I guess first I talk about the lawsuit. I originally thought maybe the lawsuit had a 50-50 chance. I'm not a lawyer, but it seemed like they made some pretty good arguments, even though I do think, there's great arguments to keep the moratorium in place. The SJC didn't want to touch it. I think that really hurts their efforts to get this resolved quickly. So I think people should watch this lawsuit, but I think it's going to take longer to resolve. And I think odds are that it will not be resolved by August 18th.
Right. And just to interject, so what is the lawsuit? Is a lawsuit on behalf of landlords?
Yes, it's on behalf of landlords who are saying, tenants are taking advantage of this. They're not paying rent, and they can pay the rent. And we're struggling because of it. And you've sort of forced this upon us unjustly. So they're trying to stop this. So this moratorium is in place till August 18th. There are efforts in the legislature to extend it, but the legislature doesn't need to pass a bill to do so. The governor can do so. And maybe with the legislature kind of looking at ways to extend it, the governor might be more likely to extend it so that sort of he takes control of the situation. And then if he extends it, I think it might even be for another 90 days. But my advice to anyone is pretty simple in this regard, is, you get on the phone to your landlord and work out a payment plan. Don't just not pay anything or hope it gets resolved on its own. I think most landlords recognize the situation we're in and are willing to defer rent payments or spread out payment over time. I think you'd be hard pressed to find landlords that just want to give away the rent for free, but I think there are probably some that are doing so. But the big issue is figuring out a payment plan that you can kind of pay your back rent in the amount of time it takes you. It's not going to really burden you once you're bringing revenue through the door again.
And everything around rents, that's being done at the state level. Nothing is being done at the city level through Marty Walsh in terms of businesses located in the city.
Well, it's really a big, right now it's a state issue. I think, certainly city officials are interceding when they can, but I think people should watch what's happening at the legislature and what's happening at the governor and what's happening in the court system with regard to this.
Gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about, not so much on a regional level, of course, with what's going on with the virus and the spikes and kind of the effect on businesses. See spikes in Arizona, Texas, Florida, and, some of the reopenings and pausing of the reopenings and even retracting some of the things. We even saw it closest in New Jersey in terms of indoor dining was supposed to open this weekend and they hit pause on that. So do you foresee any effects in terms of kind of what's going on in the macro environment? The numbers look pretty positive, I would say, in New England and Massachusetts. But do you think, obviously I assume Charlie Baker has his eyes elsewhere. Do you foresee any changes? We had one question about phase 3 on July 6th. What are kind of your expectations in the next 2 weeks, let's say, with, kind of it getting hot again in other places?
Well, I do think that, the governor's going to be looking at what's happening in other places. I don't think that I would be surprised if the governor retracts or goes back based on what's seen in other places. I really think that if we're going to go backwards, and most people really hope that doesn't happen, everyone hopes it doesn't happen. I think it's going to take a real spike in COVID cases here in Massachusetts. All the numbers show that we're I wouldn't say in the clear, but if you look at it, it's like a mountain that spikes in April, almost all the indicators, and comes back down to where we are now. And in late June, things look really good here, just based on Massachusetts. So it'd be hard to use those numbers to justify, given those are the numbers that are driving the governor's decisions, to justify going back. But I could see him maybe pausing or spreading out. With phase 2, what he did was he broke it into 2 parts. And maybe phase 3 gets broken into 2 parts where there's some things, maybe it's gyms and fitness centers open up, museums open up, and then maybe something else. Maybe it's casinos opens up in the second part of phase 3. I don't know. They really have not shared any of their thinking with me, and everyone's sort of just guessing. We won't know until we hear. And of course, the big question is, when will we hear? Phase 3 is now supposed to begin next Monday, July 6th, but the governor will have a press conference today. I'm sure he'll be asked about it. My money is on him deciding closer to the weekend, because he really wants to see how indoor dining is working first before he goes into phase 3. And indoor dining hasn't even had a full 2 weeks. So I would expect something later this week, not today, in terms of decision about whether we go to phase 3 on Monday, or he hasn't said anything about breaking into 2 parts, but he didn't say anything about breaking phase 2 into 2 parts, and that happened. So, maybe that's one way to be more cautious, is spreading out phase 3 a little bit more. I do worry that phase 4, which is all the really big events, that's not going to be 3 or 4 weeks away. I worry that's going to be much further away.
Yeah, potentially next year. 2 follow-up questions that are somewhat related. One, in terms of the spikes, we've talked a little bit about the travel industry, and it's kind of flip-flopped, where it was obviously peaking here and not so much in kind of where it is peaking now in terms of the virus. Do you kind of expect an influx, not just from the travel standpoint in the travel industry, but people just kind of fleeing to New England because, 1, it's beautiful in the summer, but 2, because the virus is not really so bad here? I know there's some quarantine restrictions and stuff like that, but is that an expectation? Let's start with that question.
I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, we did see sort of particularly from New York City in the early days, a lot of people left New York for, say, Connecticut, Cape Cod, northern New England, New Jersey too. They left New Jersey, dense populated areas, Boston to some extent. I know people that have been working in their vineyard house or their Cape Cod house since March. So what you're describing, though, are people coming a further distance, because New York, New Jersey, most of New England, we sort of got COVID. We're nowhere near beating it, but it seems like it's under control. So I would be surprised because see an influx of people from other parts of the country, because so many people are still reluctant to fly. I know a lot of people are driving, so you may get some people driving up here, but there are rural areas near other populated areas in the country that they may go to sooner. I mean, this is where I'd want to spend my summers, in New England, but that's because this is where I grew up. Maybe other people have other places they'd like to, quote, flee to. But I do think you're going to see some of it, because people leaving the cities, people leaving the hot zones, because we did see some of it in March. I just don't think you're going to see as much of it here, knock on wood, as long as we don't have a resurgence. I feel like a lot of those shifts have already happened.
Definitely. My one more question on this topic, and then we'll move on to the next topic. In terms of, being in touch with business owners and, phase 2 and how it's been going, any pulse check in terms of, positives, negative, any feedback from the community that you can share in terms of, how things have been going?
I mean, I've been talking to some store owners and restaurant owners, and, it's been, I think people are happy to start having people in again. I think it's still a little awkward. I think, you're not having the same level of business as they would normally expect at this time of year. But I haven't seen or heard any major snafus either. It seems like business is sort of prepared for this, and it seems like it's going pretty well. If you don't have some sort of way to kind of have people line up outside or have outdoor seating, it becomes harder. right now the stores are very limited in how many people they can bring inside, and so that it's a bit of a complication. The same thing with restaurants. Yeah, you can open, but maintaining the social distancing requirements does limit how many people you can have in them.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so to move on to the next topic, we had a question submitted before we came on about federal relief. We've talked a little bit about kind of state and locally. What are kind of your expectations? I know PPP, I know there's been some amendments to PPP, and I think it's in a month. The payback period either ends or begins, but I know there's been a lot of amendments, since the program was first rolled out.
The Paycheck Protection Program, today's a big day. It's the last day that you can apply. So anybody who's listening in who has not applied should consider reaching out to their bank, because the time's going to run out. And I don't expect PPP to get renewed. I think it, despite its flaws, it worked for the time it was built for. But I do think, we're finishing PPP with a reported $130 billion still left in the tank across, available to the country that had been authorized for it. So Congress is going to try to find some other way to help small businesses with that money. There have been some various ideas talked about, but nothing that serious yet. And so I think, if you're a small business, I don't know whether, it's too early to know whether if you take advantage of PPP, you'll be able to access that money, because we don't know what form it's going to be in. But just keep an eye out, because that'll be, maybe another, depending on how they write it, maybe another mad dash. PPP originally, it was a mad dash because it was in two tranches, and the first tranche ran out pretty quickly. The thing that they did to improve PPP, but still apparently they have a big surplus, was basically extending the payback period. You had to, because a lot of businesses, the idea was it's supposed to compensate you largely for payroll, but a lot of businesses were closed. So if you're just reopening this week, or say if you're reopening next week, you couldn't take advantage of it at all. So that they've adjusted to some extent that address that problem. But there's still a lot of people that PPP doesn't quite work for, and even though the interest rate is pretty low, no one really wants to take on extra debt right now if they can avoid it. So definitely. There will be small business assistance, some sort of new round of something to take advantage of the money that's left over from PPP. But I would say the better the terms are, the more universal application it is, the faster that money's going to go.
Definitely. So I have the Q&A screen up I'm on my phone today for this Zoom, but I have the Q&A box. We have a couple good questions, so why don't we try to get to some of those. One question here is, any insights on how businesses are handling employees who travel out of state for business or pleasure, and the state's 14-day self-quarantine guidelines? Will this continue in phase 3? John, do you have any insights in terms of how to manage these employees?
I've asked this of people, in both business groups and with the state government. The idea is they're not supposed to be traveling outside the state. I did my first trip to visit my parents in Connecticut over the weekend. It was the first time I left the state since this all went down. It was their 50th anniversary, and I just wanted to have an outdoor dinner with them. But you're not supposed to be going, either business or, of course, business travel is happening and pleasure travel is happening. And you're supposed to, if you go out, you are supposed to come back and quarantine yourself. I really did not leave I was pretty socially distant with my parents. I was outside of the car for a few hours and I drove right back. So it was a pretty minimal excursion outside the state for me. But I think businesses really have to think about that. And, the state's not going, the Baker administration is not, unlike in some states, they've been reluctant to enforce this 14-day quarantine because they recognize that it has some constitutional issues and they don't need another legal challenge. I'm hopeful that in phase 3, we may hear, they'll relax that a bit. But I think you were getting at the point you made earlier, the problems happening in other parts of the country may, prod the Baker administration to keep that 14-day recommended quarantine in place if you leave the state and come back.
Sure. I think this question is specifically asking about if they're a business owner and their employees, they knowingly leave the state. So if they're the business owner, they know that their employee is traveling somewhere outside of the state and then comes back. I think the question's trying to get at, should they be able to come into work? I mean, I assume the answer is no, given the guidelines.
The state rule would say no. You should stay home for 14 days. If you were going to ask me privately off of a Zoom call, I will. But I'll be honest here. I would say, it really depends on where they went and how long they were gone for, and you should be prepared to test. COVID tests and antibody tests are pretty easy to get now. Now, I mean, we'll see as more businesses bring people back to the office, maybe those tests will become more in demand and the lines will become long and hard to schedule one. But for now, they're pretty easy to get. And if your employee needs to leave the state, at the very least, for safety's sake, you should be prepared to think about having that person tested to get them back into work.
Definitely. Charlie Baker, if you're on the Zoom, this is all off the record. This is not professional medical advice. We had a question about gyms. Talk about kind of what's going on with them. Obviously, different states have, health clubs open and some are still closed. Talk about, anything you've heard in terms of, are they on track to open soon? And things like that. Anything you're hearing?
I would say that the gym owners have been pretty frustrated, as you might imagine, because in other states they've been able to open. In Massachusetts, they're in phase 3, and a number of gyms have taken. I've talked to several gym owners who say, we've got, social distancing measures in place. We're spraying down the machines. It's not clear to me as much how you get around the fitness classes. I know some fitness classes are going outside, but some of those are pretty tight inside classes. So my money is that they get to reopen next Monday. I mean, that's where I bet it happens, but I do not have access to Charlie Baker's thinking on this. I don't think, like I said, I don't think he's going to pull the trigger one way or another until he has more information on how things are going with indoor dining. It seems like things are going pretty well. I think part of that here is, at least in Massachusetts, our population is to be a little more conservative, from my understanding, compared to other states, and perhaps less likely to rush into indoor dining. So I don't think we're seeing like restaurants get overwhelmed and possibly cause an outbreak.
Sure.
So that's a good thing. But
Definitely.
gyms, I would be surprised if gyms don't reopen in some form on Monday, but you really don't know until the governor makes the decision.
Definitely. There's a lot of things swirling around for sure. Had another question. I know we talked a little bit about, what's going on with rent and things at the beginning of the call. But what's the outlook for the development market and also the commercial rent market? We talked a little bit about commercial rent, but if you want to touch on it again, maybe more so focus on kind of the commercial or the development market kind of around the city and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, right now, what's been surprising to me, given that we're in the middle of the worst recession of our lifetime, but so many of these projects resumed. I'd be hard pressed to find a large project that did not resume. And if people on the call know of one, they should let me know, because I'd be very curious to hear. So development is still moving forward at a pretty good clip. Once, some cities had more stringent rules about construction than the state, but once they were able to start reopening their construction work, a lot of these projects went right ahead. So development is doing better than I expected. What this means for, say, rents, I know that residential rents are still, we have a housing crisis. It remains in place. It's very expensive to rent or to buy in Greater Boston. And that's, one of the things that the economic development bill I talked about, the governor has a bill called Housing Choice that he is pushing through that larger bill, the economic development bill, that would make it easier to pass housing projects on a local level, because they get resisted. Right now you need a 2/3 vote for most zoning changes regarding land use votes for housing projects, and the governor wants to reduce that to 50% to help accelerate development and construction. So I think the governor and his team saying this is more important than ever. So I think they're also seeing that development is continuing, and it's possible even in a recession that local zoning rules could hamper development more than the economy. So I do think, though, commercial rents are going to have to stabilize, if not drop, probably faster on retail and restaurant. And then office. I mean, I think we've talked about this before. The sublease space that's hitting the market right now is the most we've seen in well over a decade. And so, in terms of office space, so I think office landlords are going to have to kind of rein back what they were expecting. And so we'll see some of the steepest rents, particularly in downtown. I think we'll see those level off or decline.
Sure, definitely. One topic that we haven't really had the opportunity to cover a lot in the last couple months, I would say, is sports and kind of return to sports. And I think now almost every professional sports league is either back or has presented a plan as a path back. I assume, some sports are allowing fans. I think NASCAR allowed, not that NASCAR is big around Massachusetts, but, in terms of the Sox, the Celtics, the Bruins, talk a little bit about, the sports are coming back. It's definitely going to be adjusted. How is that going to impact, I'm thinking about the Fenway neighborhood and, the fact that the Sox are going to be, playing in the stadium, but no one's going to be able to attend. It's going to be, I feel like, going to present some challenges from, if there's still restrictions around social distancing and stuff. I assume Fenway's going to be popular.
So. Massachusetts probably one of the most conservative when it comes to these large events. They're in the phase 4, and I think, like we alluded to earlier, phase 4 probably is not going to happen in July, even though minimum you could have 3 weeks between the phases. So presumably it could happen 3 weeks after July 6th, if July 6th starts phase 3. I don't think phase 4 happens this summer. We're lucky if it happens in the fall. And yeah, those events are critical to the economy of the city. At any given night, you might have, a concert, a game at the Garden, a game at Fenway, and that's like they could bring 50 to 100,000 people if you add up all the people that are coming and all the people that are working. People are attending all these events. From smaller concerts and plays that maybe bring 500 to 2,000 to, say, Fenway, you get 35,000. Not having sort of that influx of 100,000 people or so, and I'm just throwing that number out there, it could be a lot more of all the events at any given time. That's got to hurt a lot.
Sure.
And I just don't see. Unfortunately, I don't see that coming back. If we're lucky, it comes back in the fall, but it might be. I've talked to people in the concert business who do not expect concerts to resume until 2021, and we've talked a little bit about the Boston Marathon too. Boston Marathon obviously was, now, but then now it's like, will it happen in April 2021 is the big question.
Right.
I'm not sold it will. Likewise, I'm not sold that we'll see big concerts or big heavy attendance.
Well, I'm more thinking, if a game's going on at Fenway, even though people aren't allowed at the stadium, if you think about it from a social standpoint, I still think, all the bars and restaurants in the neighborhood and, whether it's the West End or Fenway.
But it's not quite the same. I mean, it's,
right. But it's the best people can do right now, so it's going to create an influx, I think, but also a challenge from the, if there's still restrictions in place, which I assume there's going to be, it's most likely going to be, restricted in some capacity, I think it's going to be a double-edged sword where these businesses are going to see a pickup when there's games and stuff, but it's also from an enforcement standpoint, it's going to be tough. So it's going to create an interesting challenge when the sports come back, from that standpoint, I think.
Yeah, I think, you might get some people who want to be there just to watch the game on TV while it's being played next door. I think it's totally different when, people, because you do hear about, during these games, when there's some people go and just kind of go to take in the atmosphere, but the atmosphere is very different if you don't have crowds of people going in and out.
Yeah.
So
it's not very far away. I guess we'll see how it plays out, but something that I've been thinking about, especially with MLB specifically, kind of laying out the plan in the last week or so, should be interesting. So that was something that was on my mind that I wanted your insight on. Anything front of your mind, John, to kind of wrap up that we weren't able to touch on? I know we'll be back in about 2 weeks from today with another episode of this, but anything in the meantime heading into the 4th of July weekend on your mind?
No, I was just checking the questions to make sure we didn't miss anybody. One question that we didn't answer was whether the money that's left over will go into the SBA's disaster loan program, which was significantly oversubscribed. I don't know the answer to that, but I was thinking the same thing, that would be a good use of the money, or at least some of the money, because there's a big backlog in the disaster loan fund. I'm just hoping that the rest of the country gets their act in gear so that we can all sort of recover from this pandemic. And I guess what I'd say is, I've been thinking about this a lot. It's COVID-19 is going to be with us for much longer than any of us had hoped, and so even when the great day comes when we're at phase 4 and the quote new normal, there's a reason why they call it the new normal. I mean, we're not going to be back to the way things were for a couple of years. And so I think, businesses need to start thinking about, okay, how do we operate long-term, knowing that the threat of COVID is right at our front door. And as people, we have to think about that ourselves and just kind of brace for, it's going to be a long haul. I mean, it really is. I'm hopeful that we can get back to the office in September at the Boston Globe, just because I miss seeing my colleagues. I think a lot of people won't be back to the office until January. And I think that, just getting back to normal, it's not going to be 100% normal for a very long time.
Definitely. Well, John, always enjoy talking with you. Appreciate everyone tuning in, whether it was your first time or you've been with us the whole way through all this. I know John appreciates it and I appreciate it. So we'll be back in 2 weeks and take more questions then. Things will continue to swirl around, I'm sure, so we'll have more to talk about. But John, have a good 4th of July and hope everyone has a good and safe 4th of July.
Great. Stay safe, everyone.
Take care.